Welcome to Socio-Witchery, a show about magic and meaning-making. I'm Stacy, sociologist, witch, and energy worker. I'll be talking about how to deepen our craft and our lives by unpacking the meanings and exploring the meaning-making strategies underneath magic and all kinds of magical workings. This is episode 2. Today I'll be deep diving into how we think about the five senses, the limitations of that, and alternative ways to think about the senses without sacrificing empirical science as a means of understanding the world. I'm so glad you're here. Let's unpack and explore. Welcome back, and thanks for joining me. Today I'm talking about epistemology, the study of how we know. That is, what we count as knowledge and what we discount. I think of epistemology in three ways, in the West anyway. I think we have faith and belief as one category of how people say they know. They just do. It doesn't require what we call evidence, insert air quotes. It's just, I believe this to be so, and that is good enough for me. And then there's intuition, which is linked closely to faith and belief and doesn't require air quotes evidence. And I believe in evidence. So when I say air quotes, I don't mean there's no such thing as evidence, just to be perfectly clear. I believe in evidence, and I believe that we have to distinguish between having evidence and not having evidence. But I think that we are missing large swaths of experience that could be evidence and because of the way we frame things. And that's really what I'm trying to interrogate in all this. But intuition, I think of as different from faith and belief because it's less macro, it's less like an umbrella system, and it may not even be a belief. Sometimes we feel we know something intuitively. You see, I can't even choose between think and feel. But that's a space that intuition occupies, is that space between think and feel. But I also think it's much more personal and it's much more kind of internal. I think there's a deeper internality to intuition. And also, or maybe therefore, it's more embodied, right? It's why we talk about gut feelings, or I know it in my heart, or something like that. Like I think it's more maybe physically identifiable or observable than faith and belief, but neither of them require what we think of as evidence because we reserve evidence for what we experience empirically in the five senses. And that's the third, for me anyway, in my thinking right now, the third epistemology, the third way we know is that we experience it in one of the five senses. So sight, sound, touch, taste, hearing. And when we can experience something empirically, then we can begin to test it, right? Then it becomes an observation of sorts and it can be tested and it can be verified. And that's how we can gather the evidence. And so what I think is really interesting is this question of what evidence is. I believe in empiricism. I'm kind of conflating my categories here or mixing them up. But I think that empiricism is a good start for differentiating between things that we know and things that we do not know. And I think that there is a difference between knowing something and believing it to be true. I'm a pro-science person. And I think that is important. But empiricism, for me, the epistemological problem here, and not the political problem that explains the epistemological problem, but the problem in thinking about the empirical as how we know things, and that's the only way, is not that empiricism is wrong. It's that it's limited. It's constrained by several things. And I can think of three in particular that I think are part of the problem. And one of them is that empiricism is limited to these senses only, right? Like we've got five senses and these are the ones that we all agree we have. And these are the ones we can understand physiologically. And so these are the ones that count. And the problem with that, and there's two problems with that as I see it. Number one is that the boundaries between them are a little bit problematic. Sight and smell and taste and sound and touch as all distinct and while not quite mutually exclusive, just kind of distinct and separate senses and sensory experiences. And I think that's a problem in a couple of ways. I mean, we know, for example, about synesthesia. And so that's when people can smell colors or hear sights or, things that when the senses don't line up that way. And then our explanation of that at this moment in history is that it's a disorder, right? That it's a pathology of sorts, or at least some sort of maladaptive or non-normative way of perceiving the world. And yet we're finding that it's increasingly common. The idea that you can smell a color or taste a sound. I mean, can we taste high pitched and can we smell purple and these kinds of questions? Or are these cognitive impairments that are causing essentially confusion in the brain. And we don't have the answers to that yet, but we do have, at least as far as I know, we don't have any definitive answers. There are theories and maybe there's some increasing evidence, but the existence of synesthesia to me suggests that we may not quite fully and accurately understand the boundaries among these five senses, that we may be a little bit off in our understanding about how these five senses work in the first place. And the second dimension of the problem with the boundaries is that there are liminal spaces in between. So besides the fact that some people can cross these boundaries, there are also these kinds of blended spaces, these that exist on the boundaries. Like if you lick a sweater, you're tasting the sweater at the same time that your tongue is experiencing the texture of the sweater. But that's not all that's going on. You're also tasting aspects of the sweater that if we were to recreate in the lab an artificial sweater flavor, you would be missing a piece of the experience of, because you would lack the feeling of it. And so the way that we have that boundary compartmentalized now, I think it misses a dimension. I guess if you combined the artificial smell, the artificial taste of the sweater so that you could taste it, and then had you lick something else that wasn't a sweater but recreated the texture, would it be the exact same experience sensorially as licking the sweater? And I suspect no. I suspect it misses something, that the sweater has a taste that is inextricable from the texture of the sweater, such that saying that the feeling and the taste are two disparate sensory experiences, I suspect misses something. Senses may not be, and I think increasingly there's growing evidence that they're not, as cleanly bounded as we assume. And so that's one problem with using these senses only. And then another problem with empiricism being linked to these five senses only, or defined by these five senses only, is, of course, what do we do about other senses? We have only articulated these five. We only really understand and recognize and value these five. And yet we have so much evidence that people, for lack of a better word, sense things in ways that don't fall into these categories. Even apart from magic and spirituality and witchery and all of these things, there are just everyday kind of quotidian experiences. You're on the line at the grocery store and you feel somebody staring at you, and you turn around and yes, indeed, somebody's staring at you. Now, you might wonder, is this a logical fallacy? Maybe you felt somebody staring at you every day at the grocery store, and you turned around every day and you caught somebody staring at you once, and so it's just a numbers game. But I'm not turning around at the grocery store every day thinking someone is staring at me. Like, that's not happening. Is that happening to you? I think usually, and again, this is anecdotal, which I'll get to in a minute, but I think usually when we feel somebody staring at us, it's because somebody is staring at us. And that's not touch, right? There's no physical contact. We don't understand that as touch. So that's one example. There's also sometimes there's a kind of anticipatory sense. You can tell someone's about to do something. Someone's about to walk in the door. You can sort of feel somehow. And again, I'm using feel because we don't have the language, and that's part of the constraint. But you know that a given action is about to occur. If we extrapolate that, we start talking about it as a kind of clairvoyance or a kind of psychicness, and that's how we get to an understanding of it. But it could just be another sense that we haven't articulated, that we don't understand, that's related to how our brains work, that we don't know. At least I don't know. Maybe there'll be a scientist, a physicist listening to this, and they'll say, I know how this works. And that would be fantastic. But in the dominant discourse, we don't understand these things as empirical. We understand as something extra sensory, right? Some above and beyond the empirical senses, but they could just be senses, and we've not tied them to an organ apart from the brain. But that doesn't mean that it's not better understood, more usefully understood as a sense the way we understand the five that we do. We've been talking about stuff like this forever. Emil Durkheim is a sociologist who, at the beginning of sociology, pretty much, who talks about collective effervescence, which is this sense of energy and groups can call up and manifest through their actions and their connections. And there's all sorts of work about the concepts like this. And that's a kind of sense, right? That's a kind of sense of connection and energy that you get at a concert or at a protest. People talk about vibes, and we haven't clarified and articulated and discovered the physiological sources of these, and so they don't count as senses. And I think that that's another limit of thinking about empiricism as the root to all knowledge. But another problem with thinking about empiricism as the way to know things is that even among those five senses, we only value particular dimensions of them, or recognize even particular dimensions of those senses. In sight, for example, we only really trust it as sight if there's form, right? It's got to have clear boundaries, and it's got to have some kind of color or opacity to it. It's got to be recognizable in our understanding and perception of an object or a person or a category that pre-exists for it to really count as sight. It's got to have recognizability. And recognizability is not a sense. It's an aspect of our perception, which is deeply social and psychological, but it undergirds what sight is. And then another example is with hearing, because in hearing, and again, I'm no ear doctor, right? I don't even know the right term for an ear doctor. And I've not done deep dives into the science of this. That's not my field. And part of this is an outcome of specialization and fragmentation of fields, of all this expertise in different areas, and other people thinking about related areas don't know anything about it. And that makes it tough to really create progression in how we know things. But I digress. What I'm thinking about in terms of hearing is that we think of hearing as a particular thing, a particular experience. It has a certain clarity to it and a certain kind of range. And when those don't add up, we say our ears are clogged or plugged because we're sick, or maybe we have tinnitus, so you can't hear, or you're only hearing a ringing or something. And so we think about our hearing as not working when it's not hearing clearly or it's not hearing a particular range. But in truth, when things are muffled or when our ears are clogged, we are hearing differences. We're hearing differently. We're hearing thuds and softness and muffles and maybe pulsing and throbbing and things that we don't hear when our ears are not plugged or clogged. And the ringing that we hear when we have tinnitus is we're hearing a thing that we don't normally hear, but we think of it as not hearing well. So one other problem with empiricism as the way to know is that we're also constrained by the narrow way that we define what these senses are and how they work. And so then even if we do think we saw something or we heard something, it's a problem with our eyes or a problem with our ears if we're seeing or hearing it differently. So and we need that, right? We need to be able to diagnose vision problems and hearing problems. Like, I'm not suggesting we throw away the notion of pathology of these organs, but it does impact what we think of as evidence and how we acquire that evidence and how we talk about it. My last thought on the problem with empiricism as the primary privileged way of knowing is that we need witnesses. In order for empiricism to be something other than anecdotal evidence is the phrase that we use when someone has experienced or witnessed a thing, but others cannot verify it. And witnessing is one of the oldest frames of evidence. It comes down to, can someone else verify this experience that you say you had? So it's built on a fundamental mistrust of our own experience and verifiability as a way to bolster and balance our infallibility as perceivers. So we need other people to verify the experience. And for ourselves, I think, did you see that? Did you hear that? And then that becomes the basis. And again, completely understandably, for what we consider shared knowledge. Yes, I saw it too. Yes, I heard it too. And that's the basis for empiricism. If I tell you that I saw a dragon in my living room this morning, and you come to my house and you don't see a dragon, then you have ample cause to suspect that I saw no dragon, or if I saw a dragon, that was a manifestation of something that is wrong or amiss with me, and not, in fact, of the presence of a dragon in my living room, at least as you understand dragons. And so that's obviously very, very important. But the problem is that perception, and this is moving away from the five senses directly for a minute, perception is very individualized, and it intersects with all sorts of demographic categories. We know, for example, that gender impacts how we think about color, but biological sex impacts how we see color. People don't all see navy blue and black the same way. But regardless of whether it is linked to assigned sex or linked to hormones or linked to narratives of masculinity and femininity and ranges of colors, our perceptions of and understandings and appreciation of gradations of color are related to gender and to sex. And then these memes that go around every couple of years, I guess, on my Facebook, where there's a picture of something, a dress or a pair of shoes, and then half the population thinks it's green and half the population thinks it's pink. So these are different colors being identified, different perceptions of the same reality. And friends and families are walking around going, really? You see green? I'm looking right at it. I see pink. And so we know that those distinctions exist. We know that there are sex-linked difference in smell. We know that people smell differently based on biological sex. And that doesn't even take into account what role gender might be playing in mediating how we smell and what is wrapped up, what kind of identity pieces are wrapped up in being able to smell. I mean, I've heard lots of women brag about their senses of smell. I don't think I've ever heard a man brag about his sense of smell. Now, that doesn't mean that people who identify as women smell things better than people who identify as men necessarily. It could, but it could also mean that there are different identity pieces and relationships to the importance of that across genders. So the point is that it is difficult to base everything on witnessability and verifiability by others without thinking about how it's impacted and structured and mediated by individual perception differences. And then there's the question of situatedness. In sociology, Erving Goffman talks about situated knowledge. And it's this idea that what happens and what we know to have happened comes out of and is impacted by and shaped by and in the context of all of the things going on in a given situation. And that we can't assume that it crosses over the same way and manifests the same way in every situation, nor can we assume that would come about without that particular situatedness. Now, Goffman is not saying, well, we can only see purple when we're at our parents' house, and then we leave our parents' house and we can't see purple, nor am I. I'm just saying that all of these things illuminate the limitations of defining empiricism by 5 distinct senses, and then in turn defining how to know things as shared empiricism. So for me, this is where magic comes in and where Reiki comes in and just all of it, where transcendence comes in. I'm very interested in experiences of transcendence. I think that thinking about these sort of extrasensory or extraordinary human experiences, EHEs, where there's just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of stories of people who have experiences that we can't explain from an empirical model. And while my individual stories and your individual stories are all anecdotal and therefore not generalizable and therefore get discounted, once we start gathering them in the aggregate, we can be using them to understand how perception and observation work apart from, outside, or in between our 5 senses. And there are people doing that. It's going to take a very long time to really understand that. Last I knew, we only understood about 11% of the human brain. I mean, that's far from most of the brain, obviously. So for me, thinking about all of it, energy work, my shamanic journeys, tarot is just incredible and powerful and how that works, crystals, magic spells, intentionality, thinking about all of this means also thinking about, and again, this is for me, I have to think about how it plays into, relates to, butts up against, or challenges empiricism as a mode of knowledge, as a way that we produce knowledge and understand knowledge when I'm having these experiences and talking to people who are having experiences and witnessing experiences that are able to be sensed in some way that is not as palpable as the 5 senses paradigm would suggest. Perceptibility and palpability are broader and bigger and much wider than our understanding of the 5 senses. And I don't think that that's because our 5 senses are narrow and rigid. I think that's because the way we understand them are, and then we're also limited to just those 5 and everything else that I was saying before. So that's the space for me of magic and witchcraft and healing work and energy work and all of it and all the rest of it too. The things that I don't engage in that come out of the belief or faith frame, right? Faith healers and religious revival experiences and these kinds of things. For me, they all fall under the umbrella not of alternative or anti-science paradigms only or necessarily, but of challenges to the way that we think about empiricism and empirical knowledge and calls to figure out how to begin to think about them differently. This is really my entry point into thinking about how magic works and what spellcrafting is about and how we can do more, better spell work and spellcrafting and make everything more powerful and communicate with each other about magic and all things witchy. Thanks for joining me. I hope that this was fun and maybe food for thought. I hope you'll join me on Wednesday when I will be unpacking the idea of the sacred as it pertains to space in particular. What do we do to create sacred space? What does that mean? What does it entail? All about sacred spaces on Wednesday. See you next time on Socio Witchery.